This is Speaking of Speaking. Quick tips and tools to take you from stage fright to spotlight. This podcast gives you an inside look from the world of public speaking and the speaking secrets you need to be bold from the stage, no matter what business you're in. The host of Speaking, Carl Richards.
Thank you, Matt. Yes, another edition of the Speaking of Speaking podcast, and we are very blessed to have a guest joining us today. Case Lane is an entrepreneur, writer, podcaster, and the founder of Ready Entrepreneur, which helps entrepreneurs start an online business, which is basically where we're spending a lot of our time right now. So, Case, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
And you can probably tell by the title, we're going to be talking about something that is very, well, it's not nouveau, but it certainly is becoming that way. It's certainly the new way of getting speaking gigs, and that's through podcast guesting or being a guest on other people's podcasts. It's the latest opportunity, maybe not the latest, but it's certainly a way that a lot of people are gravitating to getting their word out there. So, Case, thanks for bringing your expertise to the platform today. I want to start out by giving you an opportunity to just share a little bit more in a little bit more detail about Ready Entrepreneur and some of the things that you do to help entrepreneurs get ready to go into an online world.
Absolutely. Well, this opportunity right now for online business, I don't know if it's ever been better, but it is certainly the opportunity of a lifetime for a lot of people. Basically, what I do is help prepare people for online business, because when I got into this, like so many people, I just did everything because I wasn't sure what to do. And It's not like there's a clear path. And even the gurus that will tell you just to follow their one true proven method, like that, is not always it may not work for you because the context of what you're doing might be totally different.
Sure.
So my trial and error and my chasing all the shiny apples and so on, I've created a process for you to, the next aspiring entrepreneur who's looking at the landscape to actually have a path that you can follow to say, okay, I'd like to go through this. I want to learn. So I go right from the very beginning. I do a whole setup process, foundational process around just being an entrepreneur on your own. Most people start on their own, and how you get organized and get your mindset set. And then we get into your idea, which online platform you want to be on, which community you're going to target, and of course, the content that you're going to create. And then we go from there.
It's funny how you mentioned, Case, the gurus, and these are gurus that have at least 100,000 people, if not 10 times that in their network, and they say, oh, just follow my system. It worked for these people. It doesn't necessarily work for everybody. Right. So I'm glad you mentioned that you're not the only one that's, heard from a guru or certainly taken some training and gone, I don't know why it's not working for me. Right. But you're certainly right when we talk about, the online world being pretty much where it's at, because we're not permitted in these COVID times. And I know that people who will be listening to this podcast, years down the line will be like, okay, well, what was that COVID thing again?
Yeah.
They'll be, remember that when we had that thing and we couldn't do physical events. But it's true. It's a virtual world we live in right now. And podcasting is just another way for people to expand their virtual or digital footprint and have other people explore their content and explore them. And it's that know, like, and trust factor. And certainly podcasting, in my experience, and obviously in yours, has certainly provided those opportunities. So one of the things that Chase and I there's a number of things we want to talk about that we want to jump off here, but we wanted to talk about certainly the podcasting world itself, because there are huge range of podcasts, not only subjects, but themes. And so there's certainly a number of things that people can do regardless of your expertise. You might be a perfect fit for a number of different podcasts, but what is that range? How big can this get for people?
Yeah, and that's what you're saying. This is why it's such a big opportunity. There are now, last time I checked, over 1.7 million podcasts.
Wow.
They grow my understanding is they're growing by about 100,000 a month. And part of that might be due to the situation we're in, where a lot of people are at home and starting a podcast.
Yeah.
What's great about it is the range of categories and subjects and interviews. Now, when I say 1.7 million, that means some are dramatization, some are comedy shows. So not all of them are available for interviews, but there are definitely hundreds of thousands that are talking about so many different subjects, maybe even ones you haven't thought of. And so when you go out there looking as a speaker, where you can be interviewing and talking about your favorite subject. You can go into the podcast directories. You see just this range of categories, and you'd be really surprised by how many people are out there now creating these opportunities to talk about so many different subjects from so many different angles.
And those subject matters, as you said, are endless. And you spend a lot of time actually being a guest on some of these podcasts.
Yeah, this is how it works. So I'll take a step back. I actually got into online business as a self-published author. So that's how I started everything. I was writing my own books, and I was just so taken by the opportunity that Amazon and Smashwords provided for writers to go directly to readers. And now we have a situation in general for anybody to go directly to the audience that's looking for them because of the online world that's available. So that's how I ended up going from self-published writing to being an entrepreneur, helping other entrepreneurs. But I continue to write. I'm always writing. So this year, as I was looking at the different opportunities for promotion, because the other side of the great possibility of going directly to your readers is you have to do it yourself. You don't have a company doing it for you. I think I was looking at a course actually that said, you could try podcasting, but it didn't say how to do that. So I began the research myself into how to become a guest on podcasts. And it's from that research that I've now developed the expertise, because I've gone out and I was spending 2 hours a day, every day of the week, researching podcasts, looking at the podcast world, going through all the different directories. I know I've researched more than 1,000 podcasts. And part of that is, again, that not every one of them turns out to be a place where it's good for interview. Even when you narrow down your category and so on, you might find out, that's podcast. It's in my area, but every episode is just a 5-minute tip of the week or something like that. Yeah. So that's what happens when you get into the research. But, I would say at least a third of the podcasts I looked at, I was able to reach out to, and then from there to get the interviews. So I ended up doing all of these interviews, and I was telling my friend Nan McKay, who's the host of Trailblazers Impact podcast, I was telling her about this whole process and how it's not a very refined process yet of how to find podcasts, because a lot of the directories and the apps are very new and they're not the robust search engine of a Google or something like that. Yeah. But I was talking about the process I had done, and she said, that's information a lot of people want to have. So I started a second wave of reaching out now to podcasters who are talking about public speaking and other subjects of communication and so on. And talking about what I've learned as a guest for guest podcasting, and how I can help other people do the same thing by learning this process.
My guest today is Case Lane, guest podcasting, the latest speaking opportunity. That's a great story, by the way. Most people wouldn't, as you said, spend that much time doing that kind of research. And as you said, and I've done a bit of a dive into this as well, not quite as in depth as you have, but when you start doing some of that research and some of that digging, it can be very tedious. It can be very overwhelming, especially if you don't know what you're looking for and you're not quite sure what exactly, because a lot of people use podcasting as a marketing tool. So you're looking for those opportunities to be a guest. You're maybe wanting to start your own podcast, aren't quite ready. That's why you want to start out in the guest host or the guest role rather. But like you said, it's still an uncharted territory. Podcasting is still, in my estimation, and I think we can agree with this, it's still the Wild West in some ways. There's still so many opportunities for growth and potential, not just for people who want to have podcasts, but for people who want to guest on podcasts. And there's so many opportunities still, even for, let's not even get, this could be another topic altogether. We'll have to bring you back for this one, but about sponsorships and marketing and promotion. That exists, but it's expanding, maybe not rapidly, but you're starting to see some expansion in that area. But navigating through all that, if I can use the word clutter and noise, because when you open your podcast app on your phone, you go, okay, I don't even know where to start. Then you type in a few keywords and you go, okay, well, that didn't get me too many launches. Then you write maybe a list of 20 keywords and go try those out. And that's, I think, where people get bogged down is in that, the research, the in-depth process. So let me ask you this question. What's the best way, or how can people navigate through some of those podcast directories or those podcasts that are out there?
So a podcast directory is a listing of all the podcasts. They're usually on the apps like Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and so on. And some of them are just standalone websites like podcast.com. So what you do, first of all, is you have to have in your mind your message. So, and I'm not going to go into detail about how you'd come up with your pitch and everything, but you have to know for sure what you want to talk about, because that's where your keywords and your categories are going to come from. And as I mentioned, these are not robust search engines like Google or so on. It's very generalized. So the categories are broad: business, health, finance, whatever. No, finance is probably under business. Like they're very broad categories. So you really have to think about what words would people put in a podcast title, because you'll either search by the category that the podcast itself has defined it, that it falls into, or you're searching by title. So if you come up with a word like I used entrepreneur, so every podcast with the word entrepreneur in the title would come up. But that doesn't mean I'm catching every podcast in that area, because they could have different names. The same thing with public speaking. So first thing is think about what those categories and keywords are, and just make a long list of them, because it is a process that can go on for a long time. And then you start putting them into the search engine, the different directories. And what I like, there are some directories that will give you thousands of search returns results for the words that you're searching for. And there are others that are not sophisticated. Most people say just look at Apple Podcasts, but Apple Podcasts won't give you more than 100, maybe 200 results.
Right.
And they'll give them to you from the top down. Of course, everybody wants to be on the top podcasts in the world, but that's not everybody's opportunity. You want to be able to go deeper. It's a list of 1 million plus. So you want to be able to go deeper into it, use other directories. So I use directories that return a lot more search results like Podchaser does and Blueberry does. You want to really get into that. And then I just make a list of all the ones that look like they might be relevant. And then I get into the research.
It's funny when you talk about the keyword search, because before I launched my podcast, I wanted to see what was out there in the public speaking world. And just doing the search public speaking, there is a barrage of, even under that theme, you would think public speaking, you'd be able to narrow it down to public speaker training. And those podcasts do exist, of course. But as soon as you type in public speaking, you get everything from TED Talks, you get Toastmasters groups that have podcasts that exist in the podcast universe. And then you'll get people who, as you said, in the directory, there are people that, for example, they have content, and maybe the content has lived there for quite a while, but they're still in the top 100 or whatever those numbers are. And then as you dive a little bit deeper with different keywords, then you finally get to see what's out there. But that initial search, if you only used 1 or 2 keywords, you might be selling yourself short with finding out what exactly exists in the podcast universe, whether it be as a host of your own podcast, or as we're talking about today, being a guest that you could have a viable opportunity to promote yourself using somebody else's podcast.
Yeah. One of the reasons this process is, as you said, tedious, it can be tedious, is because you actually have to look at all those search results because you're not quite sure what's there. So you'll see something, it says, speaking of speaking. Okay, great. So you go in, you take a look. Yeah. You have to see, okay, first of all, when was the last episode posted? That's the number one thing I tell people to check for, because podcasts live forever. As long as somebody's paying the hosting fees. A lot of people put up a show. Some people put up 1 episode and don't do any more. I'm always surprised by that. Except you said 1 episode in mind, but other people might not have posted anything for 3 months, and you're not sure, because podcasters it's not like a television network where you know for sure what the last episode of the season was and when the next episode of the next season is starting. It doesn't work like that. It's whatever the podcaster feels like doing. So you first of all check, and I actually use a 6-month window. I see if the show has posted, within the last 6 months, I'll reach out to them, and I might even say, if you're still doing your show, would you consider having me as a guest? So you check that. You also have to check the description. Do they even mention interviews? Then look at the episodes, because they might mention interviews in the description and then have no interviews. And that might just be because they couldn't find anyone to interview. Now, it might not be because they've changed their mind. So you have to look at that. So as you go through, and that's just the first step of finding the podcast in the directory. And then you want to take a second step of actually going to the website, finding their contact information, and so on. So when you really want to narrow down, which podcast you're going to spend your time on, because that process of getting all the way to finding their contact information and sending your pitch is a deeper process.
And here's the irony. That's how we connected.
Yes, absolutely.
That's exactly
how this process works.
So proof is in the pudding. Want to know how to be a really good guest host? Do your research first. And certainly what Case has just mentioned is it is a lengthy process. It can be intimidating at first, but certainly, you did your homework. Not only did you obviously go back the last 6 months, even if there was a little less content than I would normally like to have as a host, you saw there was content there. You found out that not only did I mention, actually, I don't know if I mentioned interviews, but I certainly, you could see from the directory of shows, even jumping from my current content, but you could see past content. I've had, I don't know, 6 or 8 or 10 different people that I've had on the podcast, and you were able to go, okay, so this particular individual is open to having guests on their podcast. Then you did a little bit more research, got my contact info, which you either got it from the directory itself, from the page, or you listened to an episode, which I know you did. You listened to one of the previous episodes, and I always mention my email address in the podcast. It's another version of your digital business card, really. Yes. When you have a podcast and you say, if you ever have a question, send me an email. And you did. And here we are today.
Here we are.
And it's proof it does work.
Yeah, it does work. And it's what I like about it. So I should say there are other ways to become a guest, and that you can pay a PR firm to, get you interviews. When you do that, you don't know how many interviews you're going to get. You don't know what they're saying about you. You don't know what information's going out. And I receive pitches. Maybe you receive pitches too, Carl, that come in and you're like, did this person ever even look at my website or whatever? Do you notice that?
Yeah, I do notice that from time to time. And every now and again, I also have been given those opportunities, or have those opportunities shared with me to pay to be a guest. And again, that's even a little bit more homework, because you have to ask yourself, if I'm paying $1,000 or $2,000 or whatever the investment is, am I going to get the ROI on that? The guesting itself, and there, we talked about the directories, and yes, it's a little bit of work to do that, but there's ways that you can be a good guest. Certainly before, but then even after. So let's talk about the before part first. What are some of the steps that people should do, other than the research, to be a good guest before record even gets hit, or even after record gets hit? What are some of the things that people should be doing?
Yeah. Before you even start pitching, remember that the podcast is audio. You have to have something to say. Okay. So if you've never sat down and thought about how you would answer questions, how you want to present your message, if you've never thought about that before, if you're just doing your work or whatever, sit down and work that out, because you really want to make sure that you are a good interviewee, that you've got your answer. You don't have to, obviously you can't have the answers to every single question, but you really need to know your stuff. So, and that will help you for the entire process, because that helps you craft your pitch. It helps you with the research process, like I just talked about, where you have to look for keywords and categories. If you really understand your subject, that will make it a lot easier. And even before that, I would say, as you're thinking about becoming a guest on a podcast, have a few things ready to go. People are going to want to see a good headshot, because there's going to be publicity going forward. Have a 2 or 3 line bio, or a longer one that you can then edit later. Be camera ready. A lot of people are surprised by this, but the number of people who listen to podcasts on YouTube is actually growing. I mean, even some reports say it's the number 1 way that people listen to podcasts. Most people don't really get right. Like, what? That's video. It's like, no, a lot of people are taking the video, they're putting it on YouTube, they're using it. And again, you can use it for promotions and everything. It's fab. This is another reason this is such a great opportunity, because you get an audio recording, which is an asset. You get a video recording quite often as well, which is also an asset. You can promote all the places that the podcast appears, all the places that the YouTube appears. So you want that as well. So, and then you also want to, if you're planning any kind of offer or something like that for the listeners, make sure you have that ready up front as well. So what that means is that when you actually go to put everything together, you've lined up all the the various pieces of that you want to have ready to deliver to the host. You've thought through your message, you're strong on that, you've created your pitch. Then when you actually go to research and you start to reach out to podcasters, that's all lined up. Then after you get your interview, you've been on the show is posted, you want to then promote. And it's a very strange thing, some hosts, so people don't really promote and everything, but remember, this is an asset for you as much as it is for a host. You reached out to a host that you have value to deliver to their audience. Now you need to take that, you're both hoping to grow your audiences. So they want to reach your audience, you want to reach their audience. So take that episode and have a plan for, all of the same plan for everything. So whether it's, I'm going to post on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, put it in my newsletter, week 1, and then 3 weeks later, I'm going to put it out there again. Or whenever I'm talking about a particular subject, I'm going to post a link to that podcast. Like, just have a plan in place so that you can immediately start promoting as soon as you know the episode's live. You don't always know when the episode's live. So most hosts will tell you. So that's one thing. You can't really prepare for when you're going to be promoting, and you could be doing 1,000 other things and suddenly you hear the show is live. But if you have a plan, then, as soon as you get the chance to create the promotional materials, you just jump in and do it. You don't have to promote the day the show goes live, but hopefully within that week.
There's a lot of information that you just shared. So, if you didn't catch it all, hit the rewind button and go back and listen to it, because that was a lot of information that Case just shared. And it's true. And I like how you mentioned about the preparation part. And that's what I like to do. And we've been through this process, is we met ahead of time. We had a quick 45-minute call before we even started recording this episode, where we got to know each other, sort of a virtual coffee, but we chatted about podcasting, we chatted about what we do, we chatted about our passions and why we do what we do. Then we figured out, okay, well then how can we record a podcast together? So we did our homework ahead of time.
Yes.
This was after you actually reached out and said, well, here are the subjects I can cover. We didn't even get to that until the later part of our call that day. Then we booked another call to actually record, and we said what we were going to do. We had it laid out. One of the things that, as a person that spent a number of years in broadcasting, there's nothing that is more frustrating than either being a guest and you're prepared and the host isn't, or being a host who is prepared and the guest isn't. And sometimes when you're in the hosting role, I don't like to do this, but sometimes you'll inadvertently ask a closed question that requires like a yes or no answer, and that's it. As a guest, if a host asks you a yes or no question, please don't just say yes or no. Give a little bit more context, and that's why it's good to have the recording option. But you don't always have those options when you're doing it for YouTube, because there maybe isn't the same amount of editing opportunity that there might be with straight audio. Right. But that preparation, I think, is very important. And the after part that you mentioned too. Oh, the other thing I wanted to mention too about the video, that's very important too, because I perceive podcasts to be audio, not audio only. I know there are people that have podcasts that are also video. You have to know and be prepared for one or the other or both. You have to know that in advance, which is a very, very crucial point. But the other thing you do need to know, like you said, is what is the schedule for afterwards? It may be not so much schedule, but when is it going live? Yeah. And if you've taken the time to, like you said, to find a host, get your information out there and share your expertise, you're doing yourself a disservice if you don't promote the podcast you are on, or if you only mention it once, or if you only post it on Facebook but not on Instagram or LinkedIn, or if you don't have it as an embed code on your website, or whatever your process is. So it's very important to do that, not only for you, but also for the host as well, because they've taken the time to provide that platform for you.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And think about why you want to be a guest on a podcast. So why did you want to do it in the first place? And people have different reasons. Yeah. I'm going to assume it's something like you're promoting a product, you are building your audience, you're reaching out, trying to grow. So make sure you use it for that. And it doesn't just become this passive thing where you just show up and say hi, and then that's the end of it. It's really, really important, I think. And you'd be surprised. Like, if you don't like spending a lot of time on social media, well, here's something. You could just promote the podcast every day. It's easy, you don't have to think of something clever to say or whatever. You could just say, hey, listen to me on this show. I'm talking about, XYZ. And I think that as you get into it, you'll really see how it can really just help with, and whatever the reason you started, it will really help you as you're going forward.
I think the other part of that promotion too, just as we're talking about that, and this is also not part of your why, but also part of it's just something you should do is, for example, if the podcast host has a Facebook community, either for their podcast or for another group that is maybe related to podcasting or their business. To me, it makes sense to, extend that relationship further and join that community, because you never know when you might be of an asset to either another podcast host or when you might be invited back to be a host on that podcast again. So that relationship building is, I would say, as important as the podcast itself, the guesting spot that you've recorded.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because let's say you're shy on social media and you haven't really started building up your audience or anything like that. As you start guesting on podcasts, reaching out to communities, like you say, join the community, maybe answer a few questions. We just make sure for sure that you like the post about your own podcast and say something about it or whatever. Yeah. People will start to see, oh, this is interesting. They'll start to follow you. Suddenly they'll show up. They'll want to friend you. They'll be on your social, and you'll begin to grow your social audience as well for exactly the reason you started. Somebody else's audience that's interested in what you're saying, and then you can join. This is one thing I think is really important about this do-it-yourself process that I'm talking about. So again, like we said, you could always pay somebody to do this for you. Yep. You can always, try and get into some big influencer network or something like that. But in this process where you're doing it yourself and putting in the time, you're making direct connections to that podcast host. Now, presumably, this person is in your subject area, it's in your topic area, that you're both in the same field. So you don't know where that connection is going to lead next. Maybe you'll end up collaborating on a virtual summit or, speaking on other stages because you'll be cross-promoting each other or something like that. You have no idea. But you actually get to make that direct connection. If you hire somebody to do it, you don't get to make that connection. You'll be on the show and that'll be it. So think about the entire process of guest podcasting, as we've been saying, much bigger than the interview. Sure, the research up front, getting to know who's out there and what they're doing, what they're talking about, appearing on the show, promoting it, and then continuing the network and the collaboration with your host in whatever your subject area is.
My guest today has been Case Lane, fantastic entrepreneur, writer, podcaster. We've been talking a lot about what it takes to be a guest before you're a guest on a podcast, long before you're a guest on a podcast. So the research process. We've also been talking about how to be a good guest on the podcast. Not so much, from the words you're going to speak, but certainly from the process of, how are you going to look? How are you going to sound? And we've also been talking about the after part as well, because the after part is equally important, I think. Case, I want to give you the opportunity, though, to, as you said, to share something of value. If you have a product or service, or if if you'd like to extend something to the audience here today, by all means, take a moment to do that.
Yes, thank you. I actually do have a free checklist for you. So all listeners, you can go to caselane.net/checklist, and I'll have the link for you. And you can go there and you'll get, it's the basic 10 steps. It's a summary of what I've just been talking about. So going through the process from the beginning, how you're looking for your categories and you're finding your relevant podcasts and so on. But it's the summary of all of that. So you'll be able to get that.
And we'll also post the link in the show notes as well for you, so you'll find it there too. But certainly go to that link. It sounds like a valuable resource to have in your toolbox as you're doing the dive into finding podcasts where you can be a valuable guest and also expand your network as well. Case, final thoughts just before we close off.
Yeah, I just want to encourage all the listeners, all of you that are thinking about this. You might have wondered, maybe you do listen to podcasts, but maybe you've been thinking, I wonder how people get there and so on. This is a very doable process. I started at zero. I didn't know, what the process was. I didn't know the hosts were. I didn't know who was out. I had heard of big name podcasts, but I never thought I'd get on those. And now I could see actually a path to getting on those ones as well, because you develop your pitch, you make sure it's really good. You get your message across, you be on other podcasts, and you're able to go to the shows, the top shows, and say, here's a body of work that I have. You develop your network and your contacts, your collaboration with podcast hosts. So you're building your entire space in your industry. So I think it's absolutely critical. And as I said at the beginning, it's such a great opportunity right now. So many new podcasts, so many new shows, a lot of people to talk to, and I just encourage you to go ahead and do it.
And Case, by the way, I actually did want to mention this too. Case is in the Podcast Launch Made Simple community. So you can certainly chat with her there when, certainly she's jumping in on a regular basis and contributing. And also, if you ever have a question, you can reach out to her, as we already said.
Absolutely.
Case, it's been a fantastic conversation with you today on guest podcasting and how to take it to the next level.
Thank you so much. Great conversation.
This is Carl Richards. As always, we sign off by saying, get out there and own the platform.
Thanks for listening to the Speaking of Speaking podcast. Fired up about something you heard today? Want to learn more? Be sure to visit carlspeaks.ca. And don't forget to follow Carl on Twitter @CarlRichards72 or join the Facebook group Speaking of Speaking.